Folks, we are live. Thanks for tuning in if you're here, and if you're watching later, thank you as well. So this week we're going to dig right back into where we left off last week, where we were focusing on this redesign of the CheatCode doc. So to catch you up, when I first launched CheatCode about a month ago, maybe a month and change, all the documentation for the free tools that we offer. So this is over at github.com/cheatcode. If you go there, you'll see all of the different boilerplates that we offer. So when I launched all those tools, I was going to do a custom piece of documentation for it, so a custom documentation UI, but I was like, I don't want to waste the time. So what I ended up doing was just using the GitHub README. And I decided after I launched, I'm like, this doesn't look that good, and it's kind of hard to navigate and wrap your head around why there's value in using these boilerplates. So what I decided was, well, I'll just go ahead and redesign it. So what I did is I came up with this design, and this was in Sketch. So this is just a mock-up of the design. This isn't an actual functional design here. And last week what we were doing is we were implementing this design. So if you didn't watch the first episode of this, go ahead and go back and watch that, because that'll give you an idea of how we got to here, which is the rough implemented version with HTML and CSS of that UI. So at this point, we don't have any real functionality to speak of. So we don't have any data wired up from a database. We're not talking any APIs or anything like that. And so that's what I wanted to do tonight, is start to look at, okay, once we have a rough design in place, what is the best way to go about starting to wire up, or at least think about the data in an application? And even though this is just going to ultimately be static documentation, I'm still approaching it with the exact same mindset I do if I'm using, or if I'm building a web application. So that's the goal tonight, is to give you some insight into how I think about this, but then also push this forward so you can kind of see how to connect the dots between the different boilerplates that CheatCode offers, but also just hopefully pick up some tips and get an idea for how to build your own stuff. So with that, what we're going to do is give Ryan a second to get his head glued on straight and think about what we want to do. So there's a couple different things that I have in mind, and to give you some insight into how I think about this stuff. So when I first come back to a project, so if I've put it down for a few days, like in this case, this has been a week. So whenever we last did the live stream, I think it was last Tuesday, I haven't looked at this. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just play with it. So I'll kind of click through, I'll hover over stuff. And again, this is contextualized to wherever I remember last being at. So if stuff's already wired up, I'll kind of click through, play with the routes, see if anything looks a little bit off, take some mental notes about like, oh, okay, well, I gotta change all this stuff. I gotta do all that. And then from there, I start to think about like, okay, well, what's next? What do I have to do to get some momentum going? And typically what I'll do is I'll look for low-hanging fruit. So I'll say like, well, I don't want to get into anything that's too technical from the start, but we do have to make some progress. So why don't we start with the API? That's what in my head, I'm starting to think, I'm like, oh, well, because we've got the rough design going, we've got the navigation going. So yeah, let's start to talk about the API. So what you haven't seen yet is that behind the scenes, to do all of the tutorials and what is currently in progress, all of the courses I'm working on, is I have a custom CMS that I built for the website. So if you head over to cheatcode.co, everything that you see here is powered by a custom CMS. So this is the CMS. I'm just running a local copy of it right now. But that's how I power everything. And what I want to do, or what we want to do tonight, is start to connect the dots between this Docs UI and this CMS. And so the starting point is going to be in the API. I think that's going to be the best place. So what I mean by in the API is in the GraphQL API. So GraphQL is the main data source that I use for everything here. Well, GraphQL connected to a MongoDB database. So that's the technical data source, but GraphQL is the middleman and all that. So what we want to do is start to set up or map out a few different things. So we want to focus on what are the different types that we're going to need. So the GraphQL types that we're going to need to describe the data. And I'll talk about how I go about writing those in such a way that they're flexible to begin with, but moving ever closer to something that's really concrete and doesn't really need to change that much. So we need to do that. And then we also need to do, we'll probably map out some resolvers, because if we can tonight, I do want to get us actually wired up so we can see request firing, data being pulled. It won't be anything serious, but it'll get us going. So what we're going to do is open up, I've got 3 different projects here. So I've got Docs, which is the project we were working on last week when we did the stream. I've got CMS, which is this UI that I just showed you. And then we've got, where is it? Getting confused. We got API. So this is the actual backend. And so all of these tools are built on the same exact things that you have access to. So if you haven't checked out the Next.js boilerplate or the Node.js server boilerplate, go and check those out, because what we're going to cover tonight will immediately transfer over to those boilerplates. I actually based the boilerplates on this. So I built these as kind of the prototype, meaning I built the API, the CMS, and technically the Docs is using the Next.js boilerplate. I think it's using the latest version of it. So using that, but then the CMS and the API was something that I used as prototypes to influence what I did with the boilerplates. So starting back in the API, this is basically the prototype of the Node.js server boilerplate that I've got up on GitHub. And what we're going to do is try and jog my memory about what is in here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder called Docs. So when it comes to organizing my API, or actually I should say, how do I organize my server? So this pattern again is going to look nearly identical to what you see in the Node.js server boilerplate. But specifically what I do is I create a directory called API, and API is kind of like this catch-all term at this point. It stands for Application Programming Interface, but it's basically just like the data for the application. And the way that I organize my data is I split it into folders with the name of I use the name topic generally just because it's generic enough, but I'll say, like, what is the topic of this data, or what is the collection, if you want to think about it that way. So I'm working with MongoDB. So if you're doing like a SQL thing, it would be like a table. But you're trying to think about, like, what are the different topics, or what are the different tables or collections that I'm trying to work with. And in this case, I've got quite a few already. And the folder I just created here is Docs. So we're going to store everything under that. And I'm going to reference this real quick. Yeah, okay. So I changed how I did this a few months back. I used to put all of my GraphQL stuff at the top level, but I found that it was quite helpful to contextualize what I was importing into other files based on nesting something under a GraphQL directory first. So what I'm going to do in Docs is create that folder. And then we're going to say in here, let's see, let's start with types. You know what, I'm just going to mock up the other file too, because we're going to need queries, and probably won't get to mutation stuff tonight, but we might if we get lucky. So the next thing I'm going to do, and this is exactly how I do this if I'm just working by myself or working with somebody else, is I just try and rough stuff out. And I think about it like a sketch on a piece of paper. I'm not trying to get it 100% yet. I'm just trying to figure out, like, okay, what are the parts? Then go back later and refine all this stuff. So the first thing that we're going to do is jump back to the UI, because I need to think about, well, what is the structure of documentation? And it's good to take your time on this stuff, because I see a lot of people that I teach one-on-one. They'll get a little hurried, like, oh, I got to rush through this, or I got to get this done. It's like, you really don't. It's actually best if you just take your time and think very carefully and deliberately about the shape of your data and what it's going to do. Because the data, though it may not seem like it, is the most important part of the application, because whatever's in the database is what ends up in the UI, and the shape of that is going to influence the user interface. It's going to influence the way that you structure all of your endpoints. So if you're using like a REST API, all of your REST endpoints, or GraphQL, it's going to inform your types and your schema and all this stuff. So you want to be relatively careful about that up front, and then, speed up as you go. So that's the way I like to think about it. It's basically like go slow at the start to speed up later. So what I want to look at in here is just like, what are the little bits of data? So like the first thing my eye latched on was this getting started. So that is, and we should, you know what, just to help me out, back in the docs, I'm going to set, because this is all static data right now. None of this is live. Where is the, there it is. So I want to add the active class name to getting started. And I'll do little tricks like that while I'm working just to kind of help me find the way. So the reason I did that is it says getting started up here, which is supposed to reflect the currently selected documentation topic on the side. And so in doing that now, it's easier for my brain to think about it and not get confused. So I see that we've got documentation has a title, but there's a grouping mechanism here. So and we talked about this last week. So there's the overall documentation title. So let's start with that. And where do we go here? So we're going to say type documentation. We'll just give it a title. And this is the title of the project. So up here we've got Fluke, and this is just a make-believe project that I made up just to flesh this out. I did this after we finished up the last stream. So we've got our documentation title, and then we've got, I don't really want to store the navigation separate. I want the documents themselves to represent how this is going to work. And I'm trying to think ahead to back over on this side when we start doing the UI. And I don't know if you can see it. Hopefully it'll work. Oh, we got to wait for Next.js to build here. There we go. Do I have anything unpublished? No. All right. So the reason I'm showing you this is not to show you the course stuff, but there's a part of the UI in the CMS that I think is going to tie into the data that I want to be careful about. So the way that I've broken up the courses is you have different sections. We'll say like section 1 of the course. And you have underneath that section all of the different lessons. So I'm starting to think in my head about this in the same exact way, because you have your main documentation or your course in this example, and then you've got your sections. And so I'm looking at sections here, and I'm thinking, okay, so the sections are these. So we do want some sort of mechanism like that where we can have a section that we add, and then underneath each of those sections we have the documents. And so the only dilemma that I see is, okay, we've got sections. Those sections can hold individual documents, but we also have these kind of freestanding documents, which means that we're going to have some sort of nested UI back over here. And just to make this clear, I'll say test, create a new lesson. And okay, so let's go back to the course. There we go. So what I'm thinking is we're going to have documentation title section, but there's going to be like a wrapper around what would be here. So if I added another section, it would show up down here. There's going to be a wrapper around that allows you to have freestanding or standalone docs, as well as nested sections of docs. Though that might be a tad ambitious for this, but we'll have to see. The other way to do this, and this just kind of popped into mind, though I've been burned by this in the past, is to skip the CMS route. So obviously building a CMS is pretty expensive in terms of time, and if it's not something that you're going to be really maintaining or working on a lot, it may not be worth it. So the thought I had is like, well, we could do this just with folder structure, meaning we could do this as like a more of a static site type of thing, and do like markdown document parsing. Yeah, that kind of defeats the purpose, because I do want to go through showing off the API. So let's go with that assumption right now. So we know that we're going to have, okay, so we've got documentation, and then the other type that I'm seeing is the documentation document. So, or documentation, call it article, post, page, documentation, page. I like page for some reason. Documentation page. That page is going to have a title, so that title maps to whatever's up here. So we've got that. And then we're going to have the content. So this actually might end up being pretty simple in terms of the data structure, which would be nice. Because the content, my goal for that is just to do it as markdown. So you'll notice back over here, I've got and a little duct tape markdown editor that I built in here. So what I'd like to do is something similar just to keep stuff consistent, and basically have it so that when I edit documentation, I'm editing markdown, and then we focus more on making it pretty and formatting and everything at the browser side or on the client side, doing CSS and converting the markdown to HTML. At least for an initial version, and then if we want to get fancy later, we can. So we got title, content. The navigation over here is going to be dynamically generated in JavaScript because that is going to be based on the different H tags or titles inside of the content. And I've already written a script for that, so we'll try and salvage that for this and see if we can get it to work. But aside from that, I'm not seeing anything else for document just yet. So the other thing we want to do is sections. So you've got a documentation section, which also has a title, and that's actually all that has. Okay, so this is usually how this process works. So I'll start to remember things. So we need IDs on all this stuff, and the reason why is right here. So a documentation page, like we just talked about, may be freestanding or it may belong to a section. So I'm going to add a key here for the section ID, and that's going to be an ID. So in the database, when we add a new documentation page, we'll ask, do we have a section ID for this or not? So this will end up technically being optional, and this is what I'll do. So I use this little syntax in my GraphQL schema to leave myself notes. So I'll put a hash sign, space, note, and then I'll just tell myself what the logic is here. So it's like, if this page belongs to a section, set this. And then that's enough. So later, if I come back and it's not immediately clear, in this case, it's going to be pretty simple. So it hopefully is pretty obvious. But later, I always call it the 6-month test. It's like 6 months down the road, am I going to understand what this is? If I'm like, I don't know why I do that, slap a note on it. And I'll do the same thing in my JavaScript as well. But I'll basically say, okay, just add a note. That way, if you can't understand it later, you come back and adapt to it really quickly. So with that, we've got documentation, page, section. And I might sound a little weird because I'm actually surprised. I was really prepared tonight for this to be like this really complex thing, but I don't think it's going to be. So I'm trying to think if we want to do a fixture, and I think we do. So let's talk about that. So fixtures, if you've never seen them before, are a way to generate data, test data for your application. So I'm gonna, and if you ever saw any of my work with Meteor, I wrote a package to do this for me called Cedar. I haven't ported that over to the CheatCode stuff yet and all the Node.js yet. So we don't have that. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just doing loops by hand. But let's look at it. So we're gonna add. Well, let's keep the names consistent. So we'll say docs.js. So the names here all map back to those folder topic names underneath API. So I'm basically saying these are the fixtures for docs. And I don't remember exactly how I did this. Okay. Yeah, I'm just using while loops for this. So we're going to do this by hand. We're going to say docs, and back in index, what am I doing? Oh, okay, so I just export a function. I call that function. So this is loaded on server startup for the API. So what we're going to do, let's go back into here, say export default. And we're going to say, well, we got to get some documentation. So we got to be careful here. So we want to say documentation equals that. We're going to say documentation pages equals, and this, again, I'm just sketching this out, trying to think like, okay, what are we going to need? So I'm basically going to say, wow. Actually, we can do, let's do for each on this. Documentation for each. Oh, no. I know why I did that. I was trying to think, like, why did you do it that way? Because in here, I think I did this. Yes, I do. So there's a really cool package called Faker on NPM that allows you to generate test data. And I did do this for posts. I wasn't sure if I had it or not. So I'm going to just steal that. Because what this is doing, so we're going to say existing documentation. And, okay, we forgot something. So here, this is importing the MongoDB collection. So if I go into docs, I'm going to add an index.js file. And this is the pattern in here. So what I did inside of the Node.js boilerplate is I wrote a library for helping you to connect to Mongo. So this is like a super stripped down version of something like a Mongoose. So the only difference is like Mongoose is more of an ORM, so it's helping you to structure your data and all that stuff. Whereas this is just me helping you to set up a connection to MongoDB as well as your collections. And then after that, you do what you want. So what I do is I export from this an instance of MongoDB, so the connection, and then you can import that and use the collection constructor. So I've defined somewhere in here, there it is. So I've defined a collection function that you can use to get access to that collection, or initialize that collection is a better way to say it, inside of your code, and then take that handler and import it elsewhere so you can actually talk directly to the collection. Because otherwise you got to do stuff like, this isn't going to be 100% right, but you say like db docs.find, and it's just kind of messy. So this is nice because it gets you down to just saying docs like that. So what we're going to do is back up, make sure I didn't break something here. Okay, so this is the courses one. So I'm going to paste this in here. That all looks fine. So this is our top level docs. So for each of the projects or tools that we're going to offer under CheatCode, we'll have a collection called docs. And I'm going to get rid of that, get rid of that. That we're not going to need for a little bit. Okay, so here I'm going to say, and I want to make sure, I'm very persnickety about titles, so I want to make sure stuff is very consistent. Okay, so docs. docs. So what I'm going to do now is look back at this and think like, okay, does it make sense to use doc? But that makes my eye twitch. So we're going to leave that as documentation. And keep going with this. So we'll keep the API side of it docs, and then the types will be a little more explicit with it. Welcome to the neuroses of a senior programmer. It'll drive you nuts sometimes. So existing documentation. So we don't need 500 docs. I'm going to say 3. So basically what this is saying is check in the database to see if we have any docs, or have we, the term is called seeding the database. So you're basically saying like fill the database with this. So we're going to check and see, do we have any docs yet? And then if we don't, or if the existing documentation is less than 3, then we're going to come down here and we're going to say, okay, while so the current iteration is less than 3, go ahead and do all this. And so this is going to be us creating the documentation. So we're going to say docs insert 1. And if you're curious, yes, I could do like a fancy MongoDB bulk insert, but it's not like this is going to cause any performance issues in production later, because this is all development stuff, so we can skip around that. So what I'm going to do is split this up so we can see our types side by side. So all we care about at this level, so for this guy, is going to be ID and title, which is easy because technically the work is already done for us. And you know what? I just noticed some stuff. So we should have a created at and updated at. So that way anybody who visits us, and I'm also thinking we need a slug, because this is going to have to be a URL in the browser. So we're going to have, because I think what I'm going to do, I haven't fully committed to this, but I'm going to basically say like docs dot, let's see, I'm forgetting here, docs.cheatcode.co/some projects. So we'll say like Node.js boilerplate. And this part right here is the thing that's actually going to be the slug. So I think we do want that, because then you'll have slug slash, and see, this is you got to be careful because you can go down the rabbit hole. So it'd be like section slash document title. That's actually not bad. So you've got docs cheatcode.com slash project slash section name if it exists, or so that'll be interesting when we do the whatchamacallit, the routing for this, because it's going to be conditional based on if there's a section or not. So we're going to have slash document title. Okay, yeah, I'm fine with that. So let's add in a slug, and that a slug is just it's the if the title was this. It's basically all lowercase, and instead of spaces you have hyphens in between each break. So that's just the slug, and that's because it's URL safe. So if I put it up here, you're not going to get something goofy from the browser like %20 on a title with spaces, and it makes it just more consistent for folks. So we're going to have ID title, and then yeah, so we don't need published at. And technically I don't need day.js here as a dependency. That was pure laziness. I just do this. So we'll just say, because all I care about is having an ISO string. So if you haven't dealt with ISO strings before, those are just dates that are like, I usually get the format wrong, but it's like year dash month dash day time 00. So it's just a human readable but still computer friendly way to represent dates in the database. So because I can read it easily, it's not like a date object which gets treated differently depending on which database tool you're looking at. It's real nice to quickly debug an application, especially because dates are a pain in the butt. So now that we've added that, what I'm going to do is come over here. I'm going to say updated at is a string. And this is one of those places I'll add a note. So I'll say ISO 8601. And ISO 8601, that's the technical standard for this type of date string. So there's actually an international standard for this format. So if you want to get real dorky, go burn a night reading through that. So got our ISO strings, got our type, and again we got the note here. So this isn't updated as it's created at. And that should be it. So let's save that. Save the types. And then let's clean up as well. So get rid of any imports we're not using. What is Lodash used for? It's not. Okay, so we don't need Lodash in here. What else do we need? Well, I think that's it. So now that we have that, the next thing we want to do is it's a good question. So the next thing we want to do, because we don't want to go full bore on types just yet, I want to do them piece by piece. So what I think we're going to do is wire up the resolvers for this. So I want to start to say, okay, let's get something where we can actually fetch data from the client. So, okay, that's what I'm thinking about. So before we do that, we got to import our fixture so it actually runs. Otherwise, we're not going to have any data. We're going to say docs from docs/docs. And then I'll just put this at the bottom. The reason these are separated like they are and structured like they are is just order of operations. So, and technically it doesn't matter now that I'm reading them. It's like these don't need to be before or anything. So you can like reorder these. Like if I needed my docs to be in the database before my users or something like that, you could do it, but it doesn't matter. And that I'm going to leave off for now because I'm the only user on this stuff. So I'm not going to worry about like ownership of documentation or anything like that just yet. And it looks like we have a bug. Docs is not defined. It is not. So we gotta say import docs from, where are we? Go up, or docs slash, that's a neat little trick. So because this is an index file, technically we can leave that off the end and just say /docs, and Node.js will automatically try and resolve for the index file. So it'll check and see, okay, docs is a folder, does it have an index file in it? If it does, it'll just load that or return that and store it in this docs variable. So if we save that, get a restart, and we're in business. So now, assuming, did I save this? I can't tell. Yeah, it looks like I did. All right, so we're going to pull up a database. And for this, because this is MongoDB, I'm using a tool called Studio 3T. It's kind of funky. I think it goes under RoboMongo as well. So this is just a little GUI for messing with MongoDB without having to go into the MongoDB shell. So in this case, I'm going to go to this one. And a bunch of these things. Yeah, because there's our docs. So there we go. So now the fixture that we set up back over here has generated three, like we asked, 3 objects or 3 documents in the database with an ID, title, slug, updated at, and created at. And we can even see, if we look here, and I don't think I talked about how this works. So we get the slugified version, and built into the Node.js boilerplate is a function called getSlug that will do that for you. And then generateID is another built-in function that generates a random hex string like this for the ID of the document. And the reason I do that is because I'm not really a big fan of the MongoDB object IDs. They're kind of unwieldy to deal with. So just having a simple random string is perfect for most cases. So we got that, and then getSlug. There's not too much to it. I use a library for this. So I use one called speaking URL. Basically all it's doing is you pass in the string that you want to slugify, so the title in this case, and then you pass that in, and then this is just some default rules. I don't remember exactly what it does, but it handles like trailing slashes or something like that. So yeah, that's that, and we've got our data. So now what we're going to do is jump over to, I guess we can start here, and GraphQL will yell at us, but that's okay. So it'll say, once I do the work in here, it'll say, oh, it's defined in your resolvers, but it's not defined in, oh, no, it won't. And we'll see why in a little bit. So I have to import all this and wire it up. So if you haven't worked with GraphQL before, or not much, what a resolver is doing is it's trying to resolve some query or some request from the client. So that's one of the magical things, or one of the features of GraphQL. I can't say how magical it is in terms of like hiding stuff from you, obscuring stuff from you. So what it's doing is it's basically saying, so assume this is, let's put a note here. So say assume on client. So if I ask GraphQL for some content, so I say like, oh, well, I want the docs, and with GraphQL syntax, it kind of looks like JSON or a JavaScript object, but not fully. It's a special syntax, or a DSL, domain-specific language is what they call it. So for this, we know that we have like an ID, a title, slug. So assuming that I wanted to run a query like this, in order to fulfill that query or give me data back, I need a resolver on my server, which is assigned back to my GraphQL schema. And we'll see how all this fits together. But the point being that we need this function to exist to say, okay, now that we've gotten the request to the server, what do we do? Because, and this is one of the parts that's kind of confusing about GraphQL for a lot of folks, is it's not a means for storing your data. So GraphQL isn't a database. It's not a data layer in any sense. All it's doing is taking you right up to the point where you need to get data or retrieve data from a database or a third-party API, and then it's taking that data that you give it and forcing it to conform to your types. So like what we just did, where'd it go? So what we just did here. So it's going to force the data that we pull out of a database to conform to these rules or these types that we've set. And so the idea being that with GraphQL, it's adding explicit structure to how your API is defined, but also the shape of the data that's being returned, and also the way that you query for that data. It makes it more flexible. So it's quite the ingenious little invention. I don't know. I know it was from Facebook, but I don't remember the name of the developer that came with the initial design. But it's clever. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say docs. And this is where I got to be careful. So I think this name is bothering me. I don't want to call it. And you got to be careful too, because you've got, it's a minefield. So you got to be careful with your naming, because document is technically protected, or can be, because you've got document in the browser. I'm going to ignore that. I'm just going to be kind of careless. So we're going to set up one resolver for documents, and in order to access those, I got to pull in our collection. And so if you're watching this live, or if you're watching after the fact, you can make fun of me in the comments for being inconsistent. So here, I could technically do this, but when there's not a name following a slash, it usually feels kind of icky. Like I don't know what I'm referencing, so here I'm just going to say /index, just so I know. So that same rule that I talked about earlier with Node.js auto-resolving that would still work. So what I'm going to say here is I'm going to say return, or we say docs. Yeah, let's keep this simple. So we're just going to say docs.find, and then we're going to pop a toArray, if I can spell it. There we go. toArray on the end. And then I'm also going to think ahead and say, well, we don't just need a list of the documentation available. Yeah, okay. So this is where this started to change in my head about the naming. So we're going to call this, see, so you've got documentation. That looks like a nightmare. Okay, so I'm going to say docs for the list and documentation for that. So documentation meaning one of our documents. And because I'm doing this kind of off the cuff, I can only go so far with these resolvers right now, but I just want to spec them out so we can try and get some rough data on the client and then polish everything up. So for this documentation, so this takes us back to, let's close that. So this takes us back to this URL. So when we're making this request, we're going to need to pull the slug of the documentation that we want to request from the database from that URL and then pass it to GraphQL. So what we can anticipate up here is saying like, well, we're going to find the documentation by its slug. So we're going to say args, and I was hesitating for a second because I was thinking, oh, well, we're going to technically have to do, I'll give you a little idea of it. So we're going to have to do an OR query at some point, because there's going to be different things we can match on. Because again, we have the problem of potentially having a section that we have to account for. So we're going to have to do an OR query to say it might be a slug by itself, or it might be a section and a slug. So we're going to have to work through that. But for now, we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to say slug, get rid of $, and we're going to say args.slug. So the idea here is that in GraphQL, when you make a request, you're going to pass some arguments, or args in this case, and args contains all of the arguments that you pass. So what we're doing here is we're basically informing the way that data is going to flow through our application. So at this point, we're kind of at like the end point, right? Because the absolute furthest you can go. So if you think about this like a line, or a string is how I think about it in my head. So I've got one end of the string and another. So one end of the string is my browser. The other end of the string is my database. So I'm trying to make as simple of a string as possible to get back to that data. So this is the end of the string here, is because we know, well, that's our database. That's the last thing we're going to talk to from our code. So we want to say, okay, that's the end of the string. And then if we back out from there, it's like, well, what's the next not in the string, if you want to think about it like that? And the next not in the string as well, that's the arguments. What are the arguments? Those are what would pass from the client. So now that would take us back to, okay, well, what's the next step in defining GraphQL endpoints, or GraphQL fields is the proper term. So that would be in the schema. And if you're a little worried or overwhelmed by this, don't worry. I'm gonna walk you through how this works exactly. So this is our starting point. Then we go and we say like, okay, the string goes up to args, and it's like, okay, the args contain a slug. Then back in the schema, now we have to add our fields. And once we do this, this will start to make a little sense. So we're gonna say docs and documentation, and I'm gonna do this because I just want to focus on one tonight so we're not getting confused. So we're going to say documentation is the field that we're going to add. And technically speaking, in your GraphQL schema, you can add different fields wherever you want, but I try and keep it alphabetical because I've found that the bigger the schema, the harder it is to manage one of these files if it's all random. It'll drive you nuts after a while. So what I was just hinting at is saying like, well, we know that one of the arguments is a slug. It's the only argument we know about right now. And we know that when we return this, we're going to return data that's in the shape of our documentation type. And how do we know that? It's like, well, what does this represent? That represents the structure of the data that we want to get back from the database. And yet you got to listen carefully to that. So the structure of the data that we're getting back from the database, not the structure that's in the database, but the structure that we want back, meaning what we want to get on the UI side of the application. So what we're doing in a GraphQL schema is we're saying, here are all of the possibilities, right? Here's all of the stuff that you can get access to. And you have two types of what are known as root fields or root queries, which are, you have a type of query, which is requesting data or reading data from a GraphQL server. And then you have mutations, which are trying to say, I need to make a change to some data. So back up here in type query, what we're doing is we're adding documentation as a field. And what we've just done is we've created the potential or the possibility for someone from the client side of an application or our application to say, okay, I want to fetch this documentation. I want to be able to say, like, okay, I want to get documentation, and I can pass in a slug and say, I want this specific one. And when this is handled by GraphQL, you can think of it like a phone book almost. So like GraphQL is your switchboard for your application. So request comes in from the client and it says, hey, I need some data. GraphQL is going to say, well, okay, what data do you need? I need documentation. So GraphQL is going to look up in its query. It's going to say, okay, there's the plug in the switchboard for the data that we want. So that here is going to map back to our resolver function here. And this is all part of the spec and the standard inside of GraphQL. So basically what you're doing is you're saying, okay, define the possibility for documentation, then explain or describe how to handle the resolution of that potential request or that potential thing that you're asking for. So here we're saying documentation, we can take in a slug as an argument. And again, just like we saw with our types, all of this stuff in GraphQL is that DSL or domain specific language. So everything is like this really custom or proprietary thing. I'm trying to think, like the only thing I can think of top of mind that's plain JavaScript is the way that you define your resolvers. But all of the like actual schema and the client side queries and all that, that's all a domain specific language. So if that looks confusing or it looks wrong, like you expect me to do like something like that because it should be JavaScript, that's why. It's just a different language altogether. But close enough and simple enough, or close enough to JavaScript and simple enough that it's quick to pick up. So we've defined our field and we've said, okay, that's going to take in a slug to say this is the documentation that we want to fetch. And then we're saying, okay, the type or the shape of the data that we want to return from that resolver, so this function, needs to look like documentation, which is the type that we've defined here. So we define our types, and then we define a field that we want to query on, returning one of those types. And then in order to fulfill any request to that field, we define a resolver that does the actual work or fetches the actual data. So that's the flow right there. So we say, okay, documentation slug, returning documentation type, and we've got our resolver here, which is saying, talk to MongoDB to say, find one of the docs with the slug matching the one passed in as the slug argument. So that gets us pretty far along. So that gets us up to the point where we're saying, okay, we've got this starting to get wired up. And you'll notice we got an error down here. So it's saying unknown type documentation. The reason why is that up at the top, and this is part of my own pattern for how I organize this. So technically speaking, you have different things called type defs. So each of our types that we define here, and notice, just to be clear, what I'm exporting from this types.js file is just a string. So there's nothing special about this. This is just a string, and I'm just using backticks because on occasion you might do some interpolation in there. So you want to pass in a variable. Well, we might bump into something like that somewhere in this project, so we'll talk about it then. But all this is a string, and then the contents of that string are what GraphQL understands. So when GraphQL parses this string, it's going to understand, oh, okay, I know what you're saying with a type. So back here in the schema, so this is, and this should be the same in the boilerplate, I think it is. So at API GraphQL schema, this again is describing all of the possibilities for data in our application. So your type defs are basically saying, these are all of the types that are available. So these guys. And then down here we have a root type of query, and that query has a bunch of fields defined on it. And then we have type mutation, which is the same as query, except the intent is different. So this has all of our mutation fields defined. So we have all of that. And then down here is where we attach our resolvers. And you can notice the name query here matches the field name type query up here. So basically the way you want to think about it is like, this is us saying these are the possible fields in the application. So all of the possible fields that we can query on. And then down here we're saying, okay, for that query type, these are all of the resolvers that map back to those fields that we defined up above. And then same exact thing for mutation. These are all of the possibilities for mutations. So on this root type mutation. And then down here, we're going to use the spread syntax. So the assumption here is that we're getting back objects from each of the files. And we'll see in just a second how this is working. So from each of our query files, and if I go up to, I think courses, yeah. So mutations and queries are exactly the same in terms of their resolvers. So we export an object from a file, and we call it mutations to say this includes all of the mutation resolvers. And then each resolver is just defined as a property on that object set to the value of a function set up to handle a GraphQL request. So by setup, I mean it has parent args and context passed to it. And we'll get into the details of all that. But the point being that we expect that file, either queries or mutations, to return an object, and then we use the spread syntax to say unpack the contents of that object onto this object, which is saying basically load these mutation resolvers into the GraphQL schema. That's the best way to think about it. Same thing here, load these query resolvers into the GraphQL schema. So what we haven't done yet is loaded any of our stuff for docs. So again, up top, I keep all of my imports. So I'm importing all of those different files. So we have like types, mutations, queries. Try and keep this alphabetical. So I'm going to say import, and we've got documentation types. So again, this is this file that's open over here in the other pane. So we've got our documentation types. So we're going to say docs/GraphQL/types. And I'm going to copy that down, and I'm going to say, okay, we've also got documentation queries. So we're going to say docs GraphQL queries. So I've got my types, queries. We don't have any mutations yet, so we're going to ignore that for now. But first thing I'm going to do is copy this keyword, documentation types. And because that contains just the raw types, that doesn't contain any of the resolvers or fields or anything, what I'm going to do is put that at the top of my type defs. And I'm going to put it alphabetical as well. So I'm going to say, okay, we've got our documentation types. If I save this, we might get an error in the console, maybe not. No. So the next thing we need to do, even though it's not yelling at us yet, is we need to load our resolver. So we've defined the possibility of the field, but we haven't loaded the resolver yet. So back up here, I'm going to copy documentation queries, and then I need to go back down to our resolvers, and on query, we're going to spread that. So what's happening is we're copying from this file all of the properties on this object that we're exporting from the file. So essentially, if I was to do this by hand, we're copying all of that and doing that. So we're just assigning those methods or those functions that are assigned back to the object here. We're assigning those to this object. So that's what the dot 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 is doing. It's just unpacking it or assigning it to this object instead. But to keep things tidy, and instead of having everything crammed into one file, we split it up into subfiles. So like here we just see this one topic that we're focused on. So that makes development and maintenance a little easier. So we've got our documentation queries loaded, and we've got our types loaded. So now our schema is actually starting to function. And this is where I have to jog my memory and see. So I've got that open here. So let's open another tab. I'm going to go to localhost 5001, I believe. It's the API. How do I nest it? I think it's API GraphQL. Yeah. Okay. So this little doohickey is pretty cool too. So though we didn't look at it yet, in the API, part of the Node.js boilerplate is a GraphQL server. So for this, I used the package Apollo Server Express. So Apollo is a suite of tools for working with GraphQL. And the team that builds that offers a server for GraphQL. So this is just an easy way to set up a GraphQL server without having to do all the manual configuration yourself. So as part of this, they give you the option of starting what's known as a playground. So playground is just a little GUI that runs in the browser that allows you to play with your GraphQL schema. So it's a nice way to debug stuff without having to get it fully wired up to the UI of your application first. So here what I want to do, and I think we can do this. Yeah, we can. So, and what's really cool about this is it has IntelliSense, so it will, because this is loading from the GraphQL server, it's aware of our schema. And because the schema is a specific format, they can just detect everything that we've offered. And you can look over here, kind of tucked into the corner, but you can see your full schema. So this is the full schema for the API. If this looks a little strange, this is everything that's in here. In docs, this gives you an idea of what the different resolvers that you have available to you are. So it's a real nice automated way to see, okay, what am I actually dealing with here? And so over here, what we're going to do is we're going to say documentation. And what we're asking for here is the actual documentation. So remember, we earlier put the fixture in place to generate the documentation for. So what we should be able to do is say, well, I want to get back from GraphQL, from the documentation field, an array of objects containing an ID, title, and slug. We'll start with those fields. And real quick, because I'm starting to think I did not do what I think I did. That's mutations. Where are we at? Here we are. Okay, so I returned a single. Oh, this is my fault. So I'm in my head thinking about doing this as a list, but we're just focused on one piece of documentation at a time. So what I'm going to do is expect back an object. So I said this was going to be an array being returned. It's not. It's going to be one object. So what I expect is to say, okay, from the documentation field, I want to ask for an object back based on that documentation type that we defined here. So by based on, I mean these are the fields that I expect to have access to. I want to ask for a subset of those fields or those properties from that data. So in this case, I just want to see the ID, title, and slug, even though we know that we have an updated at and created at as well. So we want to isolate down to just those three pieces of data. So what I'm going to do, and this should fail. Yeah, cannot query field slug on type documentation. So what we need to do is check and see. Oh, duh. You got to actually pass your variable. So down here, popped it up real quick. I don't know if it'll go back down. Yeah, so you have a way that you can pass query variables. So I can set an object, and I can say slug. And because we're in this playground, everything is by hand in terms of passing through data. So what we're going to do pull our database back up. And I'm going to copy one of these slugs because the randomly generated titles we got were pretty long. So let's copy this slug. We're going to say copy value. And then jump back over to the playground. And I'm going to pass, copy with quotes. I'm going to pass that slug. So that describes the documentation that we want to fetch. And then back up here. How do you do it in here? I think you got to say query documentation. I copied more than I thought. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap our query with this syntax. So this is the actual query that we're making, but you can give queries a name by using the keyword query followed by some name. And this is helpful when you're dealing with arguments. So in this case, I'm going to take in an argument, and an argument is prefixed by a $sign inside of your query file. So again, this is part of the way that GraphQL works. This is part of the DSL or domain-specific language. So what I'm saying here is I'm expecting this query to take in potentially, and I say potentially because if you ever see in a GraphQL, you see an exclamation point. Let's see if I can pump that up a little bit. Hopefully that'll show up for you folks. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, if I add an exclamation point, I'm saying that's required. So if you see a GraphQL query without that, then you don't need it. It's not required to be passed. So in this case, we don't require a slug, at least not yet. And so the syntax here is a little wonky. Wonky enough that I start to stutter while I'm explaining. So we've got slug. Yeah. So on the wrapper, and I want to say function, but it's not a function. What do you call it? I guess I call it a wrapper field. So you're basically saying, define my named, that's how you say it, named query. So you defined your named query with this syntax. So it looked very similar to a JavaScript function. And then inside of that, we say, what is the actual query that we want to run? So I could call this, instead of documentation, I could call this pizza and have it run all the same. So if I run it, nothing happens right now, but it doesn't care what the name of it is. So I'm going to call it the same thing. I'm going to say I want one piece of documentation, and we're querying the field documentation. This maps down to here, and this is not going to make a lot of sense right now, just because this is a bit of an abstraction based on the way that this will actually work in our application. So for now, this is just kind of a hangout and kind of follow along, and then later when we start to wire this up to the UI, then you'll start to get a feel for it. So what I'm doing is saying, okay, we're going to pass in the slug. Our named query is going to expect $slug, and then our actual query is going to say, okay, the argument slug needs to be assigned to the value of slug as copied from here. So this $slug is this $slug, so we're passing it in. And then down here, slug is mapped back to what we're passing in. So we're basically saying, okay, slug, 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 and now this is getting handed off to our GraphQL schema when we make our request. And so we're going to say, go for it, and it's saying cannot query field slug. Oh, I misread that. So this is why you gotta be careful, because I'm thinking the argument, but it's saying I can't query the field slug on type documentation. And that's correct, because our GraphQL resolver is saying, our GraphQL field is saying, I'm returning a value with a type of documentation, which means that these are the fields that you can ask me for, nothing else. And so even though we put a slug in the database for our documentation, we didn't add it to our type, which means that when we try to run a query from the client, that field has to be defined, or that property has to be defined on the type in order to ask for it. If it's not defined, then we get an error like this, where it says cannot query field slug on type documentation. So the fix is what you'd expect. We got to add that to our type. We're going to say slug is a string, and then watch our server down here restart. And now if I run this again, we get documentation null. So we're going to have to debug this a little bit here. So this all looks correct to me. So now what we're going to do, And this is technically good news because this means that, okay, the request was handled properly by the GraphQL server and it saw all of the stuff in the schema that it needed in order to try and at least fulfill the request. So we're going to go run that again. Okay, so there's nothing there. So the way that I debug this, so this is back in the API. So I'm loading up our API docs GraphQL queries.js file. So this is all of our query resolvers. What I'm doing is saying, okay, we've got a documentation field, and from that role we're saying return docs find one, which does not appear to be working. So the first thing I'm going to check is, are we getting our arguments like I think we are? And so I'm going to rerun that query and then flip back over here, and we should see. No, we don't. Why don't we see that? This should be pretty obvious. So slug as a string is expected. And then, am I on the right tab here? It's kind of hard to tell. I am. Expected string, but found slug. I feel like my syntax is wrong. Oh. It's looking for JSON data. That's why it didn't work. So I typed it without the quotes around slug and it was freaking out. So now, there we go. So now we're getting back our data from the database. And why is that? So now that our slug is actually passing through, so again, slug is defined down here. So programming the firewall, blah, blah, blah. So that slug is passed in here. And we're saying, okay, we expect this value passed in to be a type of string. And then we're going to say, okay, on the field documentation, we know that we want to have, or we expect to be able to pass an argument called slug. So we take the $ slug from here, which again is mapped back to here, and we hand that over or pass that to the GraphQL query. So now when this runs, even though we don't see it behind the scenes, the next stop is our schema. So again, remember that switchboard concept. So, and let's get these in order because this will actually make a little more sense. So we just sent a request from a client. So in this case, the GraphQL playground, right? So that's a client or a GraphQL client. So a client can be an app. It can be like a mobile app. It can be a web app. It can be anything you want. Just some client that's saying, I want to talk to the GraphQL server. So we've sent our request from the client, and now that's going to be received by the server. And so the server is going to say, okay, and again, this is a server for GraphQL, so it's aware of how GraphQL works. If this was just like a normal HTTP server, this wouldn't work. You might get a request body and some data, but it wouldn't actually turn into data from the database like we saw back here. That's where the GraphQL server comes in. So when that request is received, we get it, and remember that switchboard concept. So we're assigning the schema that we defined in this file to the server. So the server has loaded that schema, it's aware of it, so it knows all of the options. And then when the request comes in, it relays that request or passes that request through all of those options. So again, like a switchboard, it's trying to say, oh, I want this one. So what we're going to do is say, okay, well, what did we just ask for? So we asked for the documentation field. So GraphQL is going to take its little cable and it's going to say, okay, you're trying to plug into this one. And so it locks into line 55 here, documentation. And then it's going to say, okay, I found it. That's possible. And it returns the type documentation. And the fields that you asked for are defined in the type. Okay, all so far so good. So now I'm going to try to fulfill or resolve that query. And that's when I go over to the resolver and I say, okay, what's going on in the resolver? So the resolver right now is logging out our args, but more importantly, it's saying return docs.find1 utilizing that slug that we passed through. So remember that concept I talked about earlier of passing a string from one end to the other, right? With little knots on the way for like interesting points. So you have the end knot, which is this, docs.find1 or our database, and then you've got the starting point of the string, which is the client or the browser or mobile app, web app, whatever you want to call it. So we have that client talking all the way across that string to the database. The database responds, and then it sends the response back down the string. So I say string, and I'm thinking like, what are those called? Tin can phones. Like when you're a kid, you take 2 tin cans and you tie a string between them, and the sound reverberates down the string. Same exact idea is at play here. There's a lot of moving parts, so it may not seem like that, but there is a consistent thread between all the stuff. So we go from the client, and then the client talks to the server talks to the schema says, okay, got it, and then that talks to our resolvers, and the resolver talks to the database. So now, once we've gotten that request, if we're able to fulfill it, assuming that we can, what we're going to say is, okay, we've got the data, so now we're going to go backwards down the string. So we're going to send our data back, or down the wire. You might hear that phrase from time to time talking to developers. They'll say, there's data on the wire, or I'm sending it down the wire. That's the same exact analogy here. So we're saying, okay, we're going to send this data down the wire, or down back to that request as the response. So we're going to say, okay, we found some data in the database, and data in the database meaning this. So an object matching the slug, and then we're going to return that from our resolver. GraphQL is going to say, okay, I've got a response. Let me pass it through your type to make sure that it meets the structure that we anticipate. And also let me trim it down so that it only includes the fields that were asked for on the client. Because again, even though we have all of this data available to us, all of these potential things that we can ask for, we're still only asking for 3 of the 5 that are available, and we only get 3 of the 5 back. And so that's what GraphQL is doing. It's saying, okay, get it from the database and then pass it through the type. The type is going to say, okay, this is what the format of these things need to be. You only asked me for those 3, so I'm going to send that back. And then the server takes that and, again, follow that string. Now we're going back up out of the server, and we're going back to the original query. And then in this case, because we're not using a front end like a React or Vue or something like that, all we're doing is saying, okay, go ahead and spit out the response to that request, and we can see that we get our documentation. So that is the basis of what's known as CRUD in application development. So create, read, update, delete. So we kind of took out some of the parts. So we took out create, update, delete at this stage, but we'll bring that in later. But basically what we did here is the R, or the read step. So we're saying we want to read some data from a database, and then we want to return that back somewhere, back to a client somewhere, which is what we've accomplished. So with this, what this gets us is now, let's zoom that out. So that gets us now on the client, we should be able to ask for a specific piece of documentation, which is what we're going to do next. So instead of just relying solely on this playground, that's why I was all pumped up. So instead of just relying solely on the playground to test, we're actually going to wire this up to the UI and get this working. So to do it, what we need to do is clean up the windows here, and we want to pull open docs. Now docs, because it's based on, let me get some water here, I'm getting all dried out. So docs, because it's based on, I'm having a blank out. The Next.js boilerplate, there we go. Because it's based on the Next.js boilerplate, we have a built-in GraphQL client ready to go for us. Meaning this is already set up to connect to a GraphQL server and configure everything so that it just works out of the box. We don't have to think about anything. And so this GraphQL client, and I'm trying to remember, I think it's also set up technically to do the server. So what I'm looking at here is the URI, which is, this is the URI or the URL where the GraphQL server is available. Because remember, we're running separate applications here. So the API is the back end, docs is the front end. Docs, that front end is going to talk to the API in the back end. And this URL tells us where the GraphQL server lives to fulfill our requests. And so I'm looking for settings, development. And yes, it is. Okay, so by default, the Node.js server boilerplate runs on port 5001, and it registers the GraphQL server at API/GraphQL on that endpoint. So this should just work, and that's just metadata. So yeah, I think this will just connect. We should be good to go. So with that, now we need to be careful. So I'm gonna, where am I? I'm at 5,000. Okay, so we're going to start back at 5,000 because we know this is our index, and now we're going to start to reorganize this quite a bit. So last we left off on the front end, I believe. Yeah, we did. So we, just to be lazy, we put all of our design inside of the index component. But in this case, we don't want to do that because what we're trying to do is say, okay, we want to render a specific piece of documentation. And maybe later, I don't know exactly how this is going to work, but maybe there will be an index page that lists out all of the different documentation available. So what we're going to do now is copy this real quick into its own page file and then start to think about, like I hinted at earlier with the URL structure. So start to look at, okay, how is the URL going to play a role in this? So like the document, if I can spell it, documentation title. So that slug, how do we use that to map back to documentation? So what we're going to do is go ahead and copy all of this, and I'm going to create a new folder, and we're going to have, and you got to be careful here because with Next.js, this is also your router. So you're defining routes when you define a folder inside of pages. And I might be misleading you. I am. And here's why. Let me show you. So technically speaking, if I create a folder under pages called docs, we're going to have a trailing docs like that. But remember what I said earlier is I want to have docs.cheatcode.co as the base URL when this goes into production. So that's a tad redundant for my taste. There's no reason to say /docs again after you've already specified, like, okay, this is the documentation website. So instead of making this a folder, what we're going to do, and I do this semi-reluctantly. I think we can do this. So in GraphQL, you can create pages that rely on a dynamic value. So let me show you an example of this because it'll make a little more sense. So by dynamic value, by default in the Next.js boilerplate, I include an example called documents. So not to be confusing, documentation is what we're focused on. Documents is the example in the boilerplate. But in there, I include the ability to render an individual document. And you've got the syntax in Next.js to define a page whose URL is variable, meaning it can change, as documents/ID. So just to make sure that's clear, so we'd have like it's like documents/some random ID. That same pattern is going to apply for the documentation here. So what I just did instinctively, and it's confusing now, but I think over time this is going to start to make more sense in the context of the project. So what I'm doing now is I'm assuming, well, we already know this is the base of the URL, and what I care about is, again, we'll say, just to shorten it, doc-title. So I care about the slug of the documentation, and so that's going to be at the root URL. And so I know that inside of there, and actually before I do that, let's type this out again. So I'm going to potentially have a section, or I'm going to have an index by itself. So I think what we can do is say slug, and we're going to say index. We'll be able to prove this pretty easily. So I'm going to copy all of this component and paste it in here. So again, just moving that from the index.js at the root of pages and moving it into this URL structure. So I'm going to say slug index, and what do I expect? So at that point, I would expect that to load the root of the documentation, but not one of the nested pages, which is fine. So let's try and get up to there, and then it'll be a little easier to understand what we're doing. Yeah, I'm a little reluctant, but it'll be okay. So what I'm also going to do now that we've backed that up or we've moved that over to that new file, I'm going to get rid of the original index.js so I don't get confused. So I'm going to close that. And what we're going to do is say, come back over here. Yeah, let's just mess with this. So we're just going to say doc title. Site can't be reached. I crashed it. You have added a custom mirror page. What's the error? That doesn't sound like a problem. So, oh, duh, because I'm trying to go to the actual URL. We want to be at localhost 5000/doc-title. Okay. So this is saying module not found, search input. Okay, because we changed the path. So because I copied that component from pages index.js, this path no longer exists. So we got to go up by 2 because we've moved this into a nested folder. So I got to say /, and styles does not exist either. So we can just do one of these doohickeys. We're just going to drag styles into there. So now save that, and it should be a little happier. Beautiful. Okay, so now we know that that URL structure works at least from an initial point of view. So we're saying, okay, we want to go into this documentation, and we want to load the index. So again, we're going to keep moving this component around, but right now we're just trying to work our way to actually fetching this data and making sure that it maps correctly. So what I'm going to do is change this component slightly. So right now all it's doing is returning the data. This is a big component because it's got all the handwritten data in there as opposed to just rendering stuff out. Okay, so the reason I did that is I'm going to need to run some code at the top here. So I took it from just returning the component that we're rendering, and I set it to a function body. So what I'm going to do at the top here is say, okay, I need to get access to the params from the route. And the params from the route are this part, doc-title. I need to be able to access those. So, and that's in order to do queries or anything like that. So I'm going to say, what is it? I think it's just router, and then we can use the use router hook from next router. I think that's right. And there's some examples in here too, so if I forget stuff, I'll go reference it. So I think it's next/router. And all I'm going to do is log that out, and we're going to inspect the object because I want to make sure that what we're after is on there. We're going to open a console. Okay, so this is our router object, and yes, it does have what I expected. So notice that all the way down here, we've got query, and in our slug position, we have doc title. So the reason that worked is because we used with this square braces syntax for our folder name, we put slug in there. So if I change that to pizza, we would see query pizza right here instead with doc title in it. So because we called it slug, we get it as slug. And that syntax tells Next.js, okay, this is a parameterized route, meaning it's going to be a variable value for the URL. It's not always going to be the same. So that's why that's working. And that does what I expected. And the reason we need that is, remember, back in our GraphQL query, well, we want to ask for a specific piece of documentation. So what we're going to do is take that URL, we're going to hand that off to GraphQL to run our query. So let's see here. We need to get to router.query slug. So I'm just going to say slug router query slug. And what I'm doing here is just using the, I think it's called optional chaining in JavaScript. This is a newer feature of the language. So this allows you to basically say, if the router object exists, if the query object exists, try and get the slug value from the router.query object. So it's just a nice way to avoid having to write something like router and router.query and router.query slug like that. Same exact thing, but obviously much shorter. So that should get us our slug. And I'm going to take advantage of the hot reload in Next.js. So I'm just going to let that log out. And we can see that's correct. We get doc title. So now I need to load up. What am I thinking about? I need to load up use query. And most of the projects I'm working on do not use the hook version, so I forget how this is formatted. Okay, that makes sense. So what we're going to do is copy that and paste it in here. So use query, just like we saw with use router, this is a hook. So in React.js, which is the front end we're using because we're using Next.js, they give you hooks, which is a convention for defining the ability to do dynamic data or stateful data inside of a function-based component. So the other way to define components in React is you'll see like something like this. So a class-based component. So index extends react.component, and then you have your render method on there. What we're writing here is exactly the same in terms of the end result, which is we're going to render some content onto the screen, except the function component strips it down just to the render function. So you lose all of the lifecycle methods and all the fancy extra weight that a class gives you. So this is nice for doing lightweight UIs with React. So we're going to use the hooks convention to say, okay, well, we want to fetch some data. And I've got document query in there, but we need to fix that up. So we're going to say, so I'm going, this is again in the docs or the Next.js boilerplate. So I'm going to go to GraphQL at the root of that. And then I've got queries and I've got documents GQL. So I'm going to steal one of these and we're going to create, and see now I'm forgetting because I was inconsistent. I'll call it docs. So we've got docs GQL. And we've got documentation. And actually, let's do this to make this clear. So I'm going to copy this query that we wrote earlier and spit it out here. And so the idea being that in this file, and you'll notice that this has a special file type. So this is a .gql file or GraphQL file. In the boilerplate, I've configured it so that it automatically parses these GQL files into a string for you. So it's a little easier to work with GraphQL because otherwise you have to do stuff in line like this, which can get kind of messy. And you have to use this special, what is it? I think it's this GQL function passing in a string. So I have to write everything in line, which is kind of messy. So that's already wired up for us. And the structure that I've set it up with is you put all of your client-side GraphQL queries and mutations inside of the GraphQL folder at the root of the project. So we've got GraphQL queries, docs, and we've got our documentation query, which we know works. So assuming that we get this right, this should all play nicely together. So we've got docs GQL, and now what we're going to do is import that. So I'm going to say import documentation as, and this is intentional. So I like to be as explicit as possible in my code when I'm doing this stuff. So what I mean by that is I basically want to say, okay, don't just call this documentation because there's a lot of stuff in this file called documentation or something that looks like it. Whereas if I rename it, what I'm saying, and when I say this, technically this is being exported because of the build tool that I talked about a few minutes ago. So this is technically being exported as a named value based on this. So if I said pizza here, notice I'm leaving the field alone. So that's the field in our GraphQL schema. I can call this pizza and then say import pizza here. And what I'm doing is I'm changing the name as I import it. So I'm saying, well, I don't want to call it pizza. I want to call it documentation query. And the reason that works, or the reason that's important, is because you can do different types of queries. So we might be able to say like, we have a query called public documentation. which is what everybody else can see, but I might have another query called private documentation. And the separation being that private documentation requires me to pass like a login token or something like that with it. I'm still querying the documentation field, but it's a different query altogether based on the parameters that I'm passing, the arguments that I'm passing, and all of that. We'll likely talk about that in the future in one of these live streams. If it's not a part of the documentation stuff, then we'll definitely cover it when we do another build. Because again, if you're just tuning in, or if you're just watching this as the first episode, the goal here is to do these ideally weekly if I can keep it up, and we'll just build through applications. So right now we're working on these docs for CheatCode, but next I want to do stuff like try and build a social network and more complex stuff. Same idea. We'll just every week we'll just keep making progress until we finish it. So we'll likely look at that kind of stuff down the road where it's actually important and it makes a little more sense in context. But for now, we're just going to keep this name as documentation. And then back here, I'm going to say, okay, well, that's fine that it's called documentation, but I want to be very, very explicit, right? I want to say like, well, yeah, documentation, but documentation what? So I'm saying, well, this is the documentation query. And the second that I add query to the end of that, it immediately communicates to my brain, oh, well, that's probably a GraphQL query then. And so there's no guessing later in your code when you're like, what the hell is documentation? Where is that coming from? You don't have to guess. You're just like, oh, documentation query is being passed to use query. Makes sense. And so it saves you cycles. So if you're just starting out as a programmer, you probably know that this is very overwhelming. And I say that as somebody who's been doing this for 15 years now. It's still overwhelming at times. And so stuff like that is the way that you get around that overwhelm. You want to try and reduce the amount of stuff that your brain has to actively think about in order to do the task at hand or complete the task at hand. So naming things a certain way can trick your brain into just accepting like, oh, okay, I know what that is. I don't have to focus on it and then say like, oh, okay, what is that? I don't have to waste the brain cycles on it, so to speak. So here I got to get the path right. So we're going to go up to GraphQL queries docs.gql. So we're going to import that file. And again, we're importing that specific query. So if I add documentation2 here, I could technically import that separate as documentation2 as documentation2 query like that. Don't do that because that's confusing with that naming. But hopefully the point sticks. You can have multiple queries in one file and import specific ones into whatever code you're trying to write. So now we've got documentation set up. We've imported as documentation query, and we've passed it to use query here to say, hey, go ahead and use this query for us. And we got to import use query itself. And this is coming from at Apollo client. Good guy VS Code just hooked us up with that. It always amazes me. Like, again, like, I'm an old timer, so you didn't used to have nice little features like that. Like unless you were paying for like a really expensive IDE, and it's crazy that this is free, that it allows you to do stuff that fast. You used to have to remember and do it by hand. So we've got use query coming from @Apollo/client, and got that. We got our query imported. This is what's missing. So now I'm going to change this. So this is just shorthand. This is equivalent to me doing that. And what I'm doing is I'm passing in that slug. Now hopefully this is starting to make a little sense. I'm passing in that slug from up in the URL, doc title, and now I'm handing that off to the query. And this is identical in terms of outcome to what we were doing here. So this object here is very similar to that object we just logged right here, this router.query. So we're taking the slug, just like we had here. Now we're passing that into our query. Same exact idea. So there's no change there except for the mechanism by which we're doing it. But the actual thing is still the same. So what we're doing is saying, give us the slug off the route, call use query with documentation query, and pass that slug in. So you can do it like that, but with JavaScript, you can use shorthand like that, and it'll pass the variable slug and its contents as the property slug on this object. So we're just saying, hand this off to the variables and let it run. And so now, assuming that all this wiring is correct, if I console log data and this reruns, it doesn't work. But there's a reason. And that's because doc title doesn't exist. But you know what does is this big old honker burger of a slug. So if I spit that into there, hot dog, look at that. So now we've got our documentation back with the specific fields that we asked for. We also get this double underscore type name thing. We'll talk about that later, but basically that's just saying like this is the shape of the data that I sent back to you. And we'll talk about how to clean that up, because technically speaking, this object that we get back it's frozen by the Apollo server, meaning you can't modify it directly or anything like that. So we'll talk about how to handle that process. So we've got our slug title ID. So now what I want to do is get the title of the documentation up here. And this is when this starts to get cool, because now this thing's actually going to come to life. So we've got data. So we know that it's title equals data dot documentation title, should be it. And then we're going to say, instead of fluke, we're going to say title, just like that. So now this is a dynamic value. And that name is ridiculous, but we've officially connected this to a database. So now this thing is actually starting to work with, what did I do? Oh, I clicked the back button on the browser. There we go. Now it's starting to work. So this worked because we put in the slug of a documentation that exists in the database. That document was fetched, or that documentation was fetched from GraphQL, or from MongoDB using GraphQL, and then brought back to our client, and now we can render that data on screen. So this is a pretty big deal. So at this point, we actually have a complete flow for fetching data and rendering data on screen, which is really powerful. So now you can start to kind of think about like, well, what's the next step here? It's like, well, fetch more data, render more data. It's very simple at that point. Now, that might undersell it a little bit because we're dealing with a lot of nested data here, and this is going to get more complex. And I'm getting kind of tired. This took a little more work than I expected, so we'll keep this going next week. But basically, we've got our data coming back, and we've wrapped our head around how to run a query from the client, multiple clients, so a Next.js front end as well as this GraphQL playground. So we figure out how to do that, and we figure out how to set up our schema, add our types, add our resolvers, add all that stuff, and now we've got it actually wired up and working. So before we call it quits for the night, what I'm thinking is let's get a little bit further with content if we can, because I think it'll help to see another piece of data. So we talked about what we have: documentation, sections, and the individual documents. So we'll play with that idea. So, and now that we've got this template set up, and again, this is what I hinted at the beginning, is now that we've gone slow at the beginning, now we can go really fast because we've got the basic template that we need to do all this stuff. So what we're going to do is let's do the individual documents. Yeah, that'll be cool. So we'll ignore the navigation because that's the more complex part. But let's try and focus on getting something rendered here. And then that way we can actually see some documentation on screen. So I'm going to jump back to the API. I'm also going to hit the close save button here. So let's clean our workspace up. So we know that we have our docs types. And what I'm thinking, I'm debating. And what am I debating? So I'm debating, do we want to just store all this stuff under the same folder, or do we want to have separate? So we've got docs, docs sections, docs documents. Is that what we call it? Did I already do that? Oh, never mind. Documentation pages. Yeah, so I already put this in one place, so we're just going to leave that exactly the same. Yeah, because otherwise this is going to get confusing, spreading it out across a bunch of stuff. No, it won't. It does cause a problem because of the collections, because I like to keep because we're going to have a separate collection for documentation sections as well as that. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to rename this because this is making my eye twitch beyond belief right now. So I'm going to call it documentation, change it here to documentation. Then we're going to have to fix some stuff because it's going to be a little fussy on the server side. So we're going to say documentation. Yeah. Now, sometimes you get lucky. Now I'm confusing myself. So the only one that cares about this is here. Ah, nice. So we're still doing that, but I'm going to change docs here to documentation. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And this is I think I mentioned this earlier. So again, when I first start this stuff, I just try and sketch it out, and then I make a point to go back and rethink stuff like this. So don't just go with the very first thing that you do. Take the time to say, okay, let me get something working, and then come back and try and polish it up. And that way you eventually move towards a really clean, well-organized, easy to understand code base. As opposed to just saying like, here's it, and this is it, and we're done. And you just let it go. Which I know a lot of people do that, but don't do that. Because that just creates messes and creates headaches for everybody involved and not fun. So we've renamed documentation there. So that means we need to go over to our schema and update that. Or do we? No, we don't. No, all I did was change the name. That's the same. That's new. That's corrected. Fixtures, that's what I'm thinking about. So let's rename this to documentation. Oh yeah, that's way better. A little more wordy, so you gotta type more, but better in terms of what you get as a result. So documentation, insert one. And now this maps to our types, so yeah, that's nice and consistent. So you've got type documentation, collection documentation, fixtures documentation, queries. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. So because we're changing this, we're going to technically create a new collection in the database. And what's going on here? API fixtures docs. Well, I just changed that. Might need to restart our server. Yeah, let me do that. See if we can get it unstuck. What's it complaining about? Cannot find module docs API fixtures index. Oh, right here. What do we got here? Cannot find module docs GraphQL types. Okay, so this is starting to make sense. So back up here, where we did our imports of types and queries, we gotta say documentation like that. And there she goes. Okay, so now we've got that. We've got that. We've got that. We've got that. Okay, so now this should make more sense at this level too. So we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this documentation pages. And again, that corresponds back to the type. And I'm going to copy this collection constructor from documentation. Same exact thing, just a slightly different name. So we'll say documentation pages. And I'm going to also split off the queries and the types. So we'll try and keep those really organized. So we're going to say queries.js. And let's see here. Yeah, we want to copy this. And then I'm going to get rid of documentation. And I'm also going to get rid of sections. So what I'm doing here is I'm isolating those parts into their own directories. So I'm going to leave section intact right now until we go and create that collection. But for now, this will make sense. And actually, I just realized documentation ID is missing in our types. So I'm going to add that also over here. And I'll move this down to here. So this is the same as section. It might have just a documentation ID, or it might have a documentation ID and a section ID. So again, we're trying to think ahead as much as we can with this stuff. So we've got documentation ID, section ID, and then we need our resolvers. So this is going to be documentation page. And now we can start to see a pattern emerge. The documentation pages. Nice. But again, I'm going to do that just so it's clear. So I'm going to say documentation pages, find one. And you can take a guess as to what we're going to do. We're going to say where we have this slug. Now, there's nuances here. So again, this is a very simplistic form, but as we go with this, we'll see we're going to have to explicitly pass certain things through in order for this query to resolve, because we might have documentation with a slug that matches the documentation pages or something like that, and we don't want to get them mixed up. So what we'll likely do is add additional parameters to this query. That didn't come out. Parameters to this query to say, okay, we want to look for something more specific. So we'll have something like, we'll also pass the documentation ID or something like that, so we can be certain, like, okay, we're getting the correct documentation page for the correct documentation. And same thing with the section ID. So that's where that'll come into. We'll say, make sure we have the correct one that we asked for. So what we're going to do is say documentation pages, find one slug, arg slug, just like we did with documentation. And you can kind of guess where I'm going with this. So now I'm going to come back into the schema, go down to the field, and I'm going to say documentation page, slug, string, returns a type of documentation page. And now, just that quick, we've got a resolver and our query. And because we imported our query, oh, no, I take that back. We're not done yet. We just separated this. So we're going to copy documentation types down, and we're going to say documentation page types, page queries. And the naming convention here, this is just the way that I think about it. So let me explain what I'm getting at. So the collection name is documentation pages, but you can see here what I'm doing is I'm saying documentation page types instead of documentation pages types. That's just a little nitpick. It just reads better if I say, oh, these are the documentation page types from documentation pages. That's really hard to say. Documentation pages / GraphQL / types. So I know what that's coming from. So just like we saw earlier, we're going to add those to our type defs. So these are completely separate type defs. And again, we're just importing that string and adding it to the type defs. And then same thing with the queries. We're going to jump all the way down to our resolvers. And we're going to say, okay, documentation page queries. So we're going to add that. And assuming I did all that right, it should be defined. And do we have a fixture? I don't believe so. No. So we're going to copy the documentation one, and now we're going to add documentation pages. So we're going to spit that out. We're going to say documentation pages from documentation pages. And documentation pages, fine count. 3 is fine for now because we're not trying to get too fancy with this. Later we'll update this fixture and we'll just have it spit out massive amounts of data. And the nice part about this, and the reason I say that is because once we get the basic mechanics of this working, we're going to want to stress test it. So we're going to say, like, okay, how does this UI handle if I insert 5,000 documents? How fast or slow is it? is there anything that I can learn about optimization from doing that? So you start with a small amount of data to test just to get the wiring right. Then you flood the database and see like, okay, what's the performance of this thing? And a fixture is an easy way to generate all that data without having to sit in a form and, type it out by hand, which is a pain in the butt. So what we want to do now is look at our documentation pages type. And I'm just going to copy this. And now this is where this gets a little weird. And this actually goes back to something I hinted at earlier, talking about the order of operations or the load order of our fixtures back here. So I talked about this not being terribly important. Now it actually is important, so we got to be careful here. So, well, we'll come back to actually getting that to work. So let's just focus on the content first. So the IDs, same exact thing, generate ID. Title, we're going to do the same exact thing. That's just going to be the title that's generated up above, because again, we just copy and pasted this, so we still get our faker title there. Content, this we can use faker as well, so we're going to say faker, I think it's lorem.paragraphs. So that'll just generate a bunch of paragraph tags. I think that's what that does, or paragraphs of text. Documentation ID, now this is where we got to be careful. I think the easiest way to do this is just to say up here, we'll ask for some documentation. So we'll say await documentation. No, we won't. I know how to do it. Okay. So because we're doing this as a function, we can call this from inside of our documentation. So we'll pass intentionally a documentation ID into this function. That'll make a little bit more sense in a second here. And like we talked about, we're not going to worry about section IDs yet because that's a little more complex. And we should do the same exact thing with dates. So we're going to do updated at, created at. And get rid of all the duplicates. Okay, so the point I just made is we're going to want to piggyback on the documentation fixture in order to insert the data for this collection. And I'm just making sure we've got all of our types. We have created at. That's what's missing. So we got created at string. Again, just leave myself a little note so I know the format of it, and updated at. Okay, so now all of the fields are there. Those are correct. We can close that. We've got our resolver. Let's close that for now. Fixtures, keep that. Queries, close that. Schema, we should be good with. Documentation, keep that one. That we don't need. It's a lot of work. Okay, so now we're down to just documentation pages. Yeah. Okay, so what we want to do is we're going to call this function instead of doing it from the index here. So this is, again, this is the fixtures index where we load everything for the server side. What we're going to do is we're going to call that function from within this documentation fixture. So I'm going to open this one back up. And because we're doing a loop, this will be synchronous. So I can just say down here, actually, you know what? I take that back. We can do this in the loop. So we'll insert 3 documentation pages for each documentation. There you go. So we'll get 9 back total. So I'm going to say documentation ID here. Say generate ID. So instead of passing it directly there, so I'm going to say documentation ID. And then down here, because I know that this is an await, so I know that it's going to wait until that insert is completed, I'll know that, okay, this is actually going to be available for me to associate data with. So now I can just say documentation pages. So that import looks like it auto imported. Yeah, so I can auto import documentation pages. And again, that's just the function that we defined over here, which is anticipating a documentation ID to assign back to itself. So I can say, okay, we've got inside a documentation, create the documentation ID, assign that to the documentation itself, and then pass that along to documentation pages. So now, when we run documentation, by extension, what's happening is we're also going to run documentation pages. But in order to do that, we got to do a reset. And the reason why is if this existing documentation one says, oh, hey, I already have 3, this code's never going to run. So we want to make sure that we run this like it's the first time. And conveniently, inside of the Node.js server boilerplate, I've added a reset command. So this will actually go into MongoDB and reset your database for you. So instead of having to like manually go in and clear collections, you just run that command and it'll clear it out, and then you can start your app back up and keep going. And fixtures, documentation JS 56. That must be at the build. Object blah 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 is not a function. Is it talking about this? It's kind of hard to tell. What's it upset about? Let me comment this out and just see if that fixes it. Fixed part of it, so let's check the database. We're gonna say refresh. Okay, so I don't have any. I have documentation, and oddly I have 4. So I feel like it got tripped up on something. So I've got, it's kind of perplexing because there's not too much going on here. Documentation less than 3. Okay. And then I did not get any documentation pages. So let me do a reset again. And we'll run the server again. But this time I'm going to leave documentation pages off. See if we get to a clean startup. Okay, we do. So now I'm going to reset again, because we do want this to run. But for some reason it doesn't like. Oh, because it's trying to go up a level. It doesn't exist. You want to go here, because what we were technically doing is pointing at the documentation pages folder up here, which that's just a bunch of files, so that's not going to work. So you want // to say stay in the fixtures folder and load that function. So save that, and now this should actually start working. But conveniently, what I just noticed is that we're missing the slug on our documentation pages fixture. So we're going to say slug, get slug with title, and get slug is still imported at the top. We hadn't gotten rid of it. So now that'll be consistent. So all's well that ends well. So now database is reset. We're going to run the server again, and now we should get a successful generation of our data. Nice. And let's check the database. Say refresh all, documentation pages, and we have 9 of them. And documentation, now we have 3 again. Yeah, so it just got tripped up. And what's cool about the pages is if we look, the documentation ID is changing for each page. So it depends on the page that was generated. We can see where there should be some consistency here. ODBZ, unless I did it wrong, which I may have done. What did I do? So I said documentation. So for each iteration, generate a new ID, use that ID and pass it. No, that should be the same. Actually, let's do it this way. JP, I just saw that one. There it goes. Okay, so it did do it. It's just out of sequence. So JP. So there you go. So yeah, for each piece of documentation that we inserted 3 of the documentation pages. So that gets us what we wanted. But we're also missing in our documentation pages fixture, content's not in there, which is kind of strange. Ah, I know why. Because I didn't call the paragraphs function, which means that what we technically told it was to set content to that function, not to a call to that function, which returns the actual paragraphs as a string. So one more time, we're going to say npm run reset, save that file, and then we're going to run this one more time. And then we should be getting in the ballpark for having this work. At least I hope so. I'm fading fast. So let's see. Yep, there we go. So now we have this big old content string on each of our documentation pages. So that worked. So we've got our fixture data, we've got resolvers, we've got types, we've got fields with all that, which means we should be able to go back over to the UI and actually wire this up. Now, this is where this gets interesting. So technically speaking, right now we're at the root of the documentation. So this URL hasn't changed, and I'll refresh it just so it's clear. We're at the root of the documentation, but the expectation from the design is that we're looking at one piece of the documentation automatically. So we want to infer, like, okay, well, what page are we loading up first? What's the top level page? So eventually what we're going to need to do is figure out what is the first piece of documentation in order. And like I hinted at before, we talked about having a like a drag and drop kind of UI similar to, do I still have it open? Oh, it's broken. Is it broken, or is it just, oh, it logged me out. I got some complex passwords, so I'm not going to bother with that. Which was stupid. I noticed that right before I started tonight. I have some like goofy test password that's way too long. It should just be password. I don't know what I was thinking. But remember that drag and drop UI I talked about toward the beginning. When we have something like that, we'll be able to assign an order to all this stuff. And so we'll basically just say, what's the first page order, the first section order in the documentation? Go ahead and fetch that and load it. So in order to load it, what I'm thinking we want to do is have documentation page as a component, and we'll pass down the page slug to another component. So what I mean by that, and this is where I got to be very careful again. So this is going to be a variable value because this slug is going to change. So we're going to say and I might, no, I'm going to leave it. So I'm going to say page slug. .js. So again, that bracketed notation is saying this is a parameterized route. So this is a variable value that's going to be in the place of that URL. So up until this point, we saw, okay, the root slash this gets us up to here. So slug. Now we're adding page slug underneath that, which means we should get another one, which is, some page slug like that. And then we're going to take that to go and fetch our data from GraphQL and render our page out. At least we're going to try. So in order to do it, I'm going to copy this component. Or no, I'm not. I take that back. No, I don't. Yes, I do. No, I don't. I'm going to copy this. I'm hesitating because I'm like, well, I don't need the whole thing. But that's fine because the part I care about is right here, and technically the aside as well. So what's wrapping all of that? That will be the root. Yeah, documentation content. So I'm going to take that div, copy that, and I'm in page slug. So we're going to make that the actual component in here. And again, this will be kind of junky right now, but just as long as we can get some version of this working so you guys can see it. So we're going to ignore styles and anything fancy right now. We just want to see, can we get something on screen? And what I'm going to do, and actually I just realized I didn't change this. So this isn't that. We're going to say this is a documentation page component. So back here in index under slug, I'm going to change this to documentation just so we don't get confused. So, and this should become instead of styled docs. I'm going to be, keep your names consistent because that helps the cognitive overload. It helps to reduce it. So we're going to say styled documentation. Keep that consistent. So now this should be flowing a little better. So we've got that. We've got our page slug. Documentation page. Okay. So now in here we're going to change slug to page slug. And that's technically still slug being passed as a variable, so we're going to leave that alone. And our goal is to get the same thing here. So we're going to say documentation page dot title. So we want the title of the documentation. But what we also want, and does it give me, no, it does not give me any tags. So I'm going to say, I'll do this. So I'll just say content like that. We'll copy this down and change content there. And then the only other thing we should have to change or add is here. So we're going to say, and you can see that we haven't done this yet, so I'm thinking ahead. And we're going to change this to documentation pages. So we're going to say the documentation page query, we want to pass this slug in, get a title and some content back. So I'm going to save that, and that'll fail temporarily because we don't have this. So we're going to say documentation pages.gql. And again, this is where we keep all of our client-side GraphQL query definitions. So I'm going to copy this one from GraphQL queries docs.gql, and we'll rename that to documentation at some point. So I'm going to copy that over, change this to documentation page, and now all I'm going to do is add content to this because now we have content for the page. Remember, our documentation collection doesn't have that, but our documentation pages do. So we're going to save that. And now we've got documentation page, and let's see here. Where are we at? So we've got documentation page query, blah, 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 blah. And that should work. So the only thing we haven't done is rendered this component inside of here. And I'm hoping that we can do that. Oh, that's what I messed up. So notice how I instinctively put it as page slug. But that is not what we want to do. At least I don't think so. Well, you know what? I don't know if I've ever tried this. We'll try it just for the sake of time, but I want to see, or not components. I'm looking in the same folder. So I'm going to say dot slash. See, I instinctively went to go for components because this is technically a standalone component, but it needs to map back to a route. So I'm going to say page slug JS like that, and technically you should understand it. Looks a little weird, and we'll change that later, but for the sake of testing, I'm going to say that needs to go for the main tag. And we took that entire documentation content, so we can just say documentation content. So we'll add that as a child component of the page. Documentation content is not defined. That's what I thought. Oh, no, that was my own stupid fault. So it's documentation page, not documentation content. Give this a refresh. Okay, and we get nothing. We get a GraphQL error, which is fine. And whenever you see a 400 bad request, that usually means we're passing the wrong arguments or parameters to our query. And queries, documentation pages, documentation page, slugs. Okay, so all that's fine. Close that so we don't get confused. Let's jump back to the API, and I want to check schema. And I want to say, okay, do we have documentation page there? And you can say, like, I'm following a basic pattern of debugging this. I'm checking, like, basically a sanity check. Did I do all of this stuff? So I'm going to say documentation page exists as the field. We've got a slug. String is expected. We've imported our types. Yeah, we've imported our types and our queries, and it looks like we've rendered them. We have. Okay. And then back in the documentation pages query resolvers, we're saying documentation pages, find one, arg slug, so all that should be working. So I'm going to put a log here just to make sure this is working. I'll just put a little flag so I know what I'm looking at. And then I'm going to refresh this. Okay, so we'll notice that that query didn't run as expected. So we got to figure out why not. So back in the site, and let me check the type as well. So we've got ID title slug content. So we're going to go ID title. Ah, it's the slug. Burned us on the other one too. Okay. So now, if we refresh, okay, we don't get an error anymore. And we do get this, but we don't have a slug. And that's correct because I don't have it in the URL yet. So we're going to go to the database. And we're going to run this documentation pages query again. So to make sure that's clear, I've just got all of our seeded documentation pages. And we're going to grab, and let's be somewhat methodical about this. And you'll notice that actually I didn't even catch it. Our documentation doesn't exist anymore because we reset our database. So I need to get a new piece of documentation anyways. So this works out. So we're going to look for a documentation page that has a documentation ID of QLYCC to test with. So I'm going to say copy this value. And that's going to go up here, and we should see a title wrapped in quotes. So if we run that, good, that checks out. So we get the documentation title, but now we want to go a level deeper and go into pages. So what, I already forgot, what is it? QLYCC. So, haha, first one. So we're going to copy the value of that slug, and then we're going to add that here. Get rid of those quotes. Run it. And, well, we kind of got something. That was, I honestly didn't expect that. Why did it just nuke the entire page? Is that just a weird? I'm absolutely surprised. That doesn't make any sense. I'm sure it does make sense. I'm just not seeing it. Oh, okay. See, this is where this becomes problematic. This nested folder thing. So the thinking was right in the way that we did it. So nesting the documentation page under here. What was wrong is that the router is trying to actually redirect us to this component. So this is correct. This is the actual documentation page. But keep in mind that that component doesn't have all of the stuff around the actual page. So it's just rendering this, which is unstyled right now. So that makes sense. So let me see if I can figure this out right now, because this is kind of tricky. So you've got pages slug. I still want a dynamic value for that, but I don't want to treat it. Okay. This is kind of a pain in the butt, but we can't basically get away with what we did here. We're going to have to migrate our documentation component, so this one, into a wrapper component. Yeah, it's kind of sucks, but that's the only way to do it. So what we're going to do, because I do want to make sure we see this tonight, because otherwise this will be confusing next week. So what we're going to do is say, turn our documentation into, which it technically is already, so it's just moving stuff around. So I'm going to change this. So I'm going to close that, and then I'm going to go back into, I don't have a layouts folder, but that's okay. So I'm going to say, I am going to add that. So one of the patterns that I use when I'm dealing with React components, I have 3 different types that I define. I define page components, standalone components, and layout components. So a layout is like the whole page. So if you have like a customer facing side and an admin facing side, the layout that decides what the user sees, that I treat as its own component as well. So I'm going to create layouts, and let's move that up out of there. Come on. There it is. No, I don't want to move it into Git. Oh, it drives me nuts when it does that. I just want to move it to the root of the project. Yes. Is it in there? There we go. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder for this, and this layout is going to be called documentation. And this might mess up, but might not. Yeah, that's tricky. But I think, yeah, it'll work. It'll work. It's just, it's not going to be the most straightforward thing. So documentation, save that. Now what we need to do is add a children prop to this component. So before I was importing documentation page, we don't want to do that. What we're going to do is render the children of this component. It'll make sense in a second here. So we're going to say render the children of this component, documentation. Then, and this is where this gets interesting, so we're going to come back to page slug. And though this may seem absolutely confusing, what we're going to do is we're going to say import documentation into here from, oh no, excuse me, this is layouts, documentation. It's an index, so it'll automatically resolve. And I'm going to take that and wrap it around documentation content. Which may seem a little strange, but basically because we said render the children in here, children in React is going to be whatever we pass into the body of calling the component like this. So you can call a component like a single line. You can say like documentation like that, or you can expand it to have a body so it wraps around something. So I'm going to wrap it around this content, which will allow us to keep that layout while also keeping access to the different parts of the URLs. And I think that'll get us somewhere. I think. Let's see. And I expect it to freak out a little bit. Yeah, styles. So styles was right here. We need to move this styles up to there. Okay. And then I'm going to get rid of this index page. Okay. Yeah, now I see how to do this. So I'm going to completely get rid of this. And eventually what we'll do, I'm going to give it a really goofy name, documentation root right now. And we're going to put a to-do message in here. So we're going to say to-do, write a redirect to move users from this URL to the first documentation item in the UI. So basically what we'll do is say, can we get this to load? Hot damn, look at that. So what we can do is say, if somebody visits this URL, and this makes sense, instead of letting them visit that URL, so now it's just blank because I just swapped it with a blank component. So if they visit that URL, well, we don't want them to be at the documentation root. We want them to be at one of the pages. So if they don't specify one, what we'll do from this page is we'll call a GraphQL query, and we'll go up to the server and we'll say, okay, go ahead and fetch us the first documentation page or section, depending on what we do, that's available, and then give me the slug for that and put that in the URL. So redirect the user physically in the browser, which will redirect them to a page like this. So if we landed on introduction, for example, what would happen is, or if we landed, if we landed on this route, what would happen is we would get the slug for introduction because that's first in the list, presumptively. And then we would redirect the user to that URL. So from their perspective, they won't really see the redirect. They'll just see like, oh, okay, this is the introduction page. But behind the scenes, what we've done is we've intelligently guessed like, oh, well, we don't want you to be at the root of the documentation, so we want you to be at one of the nested levels. So that's what we're going to focus on next, now that we're up to this part, because this is pretty cool. We've got this whole thing wired up to the database. We've got it rendering content. I'm actually shocked because I thought it was going to break when I did that, but it makes sense why. So actually, let's review it real quick. So the reason that worked, so we talked about the URLs up here, and we've got the two parts. So we've got the slug of the documentation page and the slug of the documentation. So here, slug of the documentation maps to slug of the documentation. Page slug maps to the slug of the documentation page. So Next.js is able to resolve that path. It's basically able to say slash some documentation slug slash some documentation page slug. And because we just use that wrapper component, we get the effect of having been at the documentation root, so slash documentation slug. But because we did it this way, it only looks that way to the user, but behind the scenes, we're technically rendering the documentation page component itself. And if we scroll up here, we're rendering documentation page. So that's what this screen is. But inside of that, we're rendering documentation, which gives us our search and nav and all that stuff wrapped around our content. So that is a perfect time to call it quits for the evening. So thank you for watching. Thank you to the folks that tuned in. I saw a few people jump in and out while I've been doing this, so I appreciate you watching. If you haven't already, go ahead and make sure to hit subscribe down below, and also hit like as well, because that lets me know that this is actually enjoyable and I'm not just sitting here kind of like, doing nothing and not providing any educational value or entertainment or anything like that. So definitely let me know. Go ahead and hit like and hit the subscribe button. That way I know to keep making this stuff because you guys want to see it. And hit the notification bell as well, because when I schedule these live streams, it should send you a notification. So you get the little message up in the bell at the top of the site. So thank you for tuning in. That's going to do it for me. And if you want to see this video, it should be up relatively soon. So if you're just tuning in, at the end of this, it should be uploaded pretty soon. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.